Good morning, class, and welcome to CIS 4670. And this is for week 5. We're going to be covering Chapter 4 on Identity and Access Management. So let's go ahead and get started. So Chapter 4 is going to cover how we access systems, how we identify users, and how we give permissions or authorization to those users. So there are different ways that the Security Plus exam covers this. For example, given a scenario, use appropriate software tools to assess the security posture of an organization. That is from an audit perspective. A lot of those tools will look at how users are authenticated onto systems and if enough security layers are put into place and if those security controls are adequate. Given a scenario, troubleshoot common security issues. So here we will look at how the tools that we use for vulnerability assessment, vulnerability scanning, etc. Given a scenario, analyze and interpret output from these security technologies. That's pretty self-explanatory, so that's going to be an analysis step. Compare and contrast identity and access management concepts. So here we're going to look at different protocols that are used for security and identity management, such as Radius, TACAX Bus, Kerberos, etc. Given a scenario, install and configure identity and access services. So here we'll look at different types of security protocols, again, how they're implemented, also technologies such as tokens, smart cards, multi-factor authentication, things like that. And given a scenario, implement identity and access management control. So the audit that goes behind those tools. So there's a lot of terminology on pages 124 and 125 that deal with the false rejection rate, false positives, host-based intrusion detection systems, challenge handshake authentication protocol, OAuth, open authentication standards, etc. Look those over. Those are good for quizzes and exams, as well as the Security Plus exam itself to be tested on. So, diving in here, tools that you can use to assess your network. So, a couple of passive tools are protocol analyzers, and if you're not really good at Wireshark at this point in time, you need to start playing around with it. The best way that I know how to tell students to get good with Wireshark is to just get a switch, set up a span port or a mirror port on it, hook a laptop up to that span port so that frames dump to it, and then use another laptop on that switch that is connected to the internet, connected to an internet router somehow, and just start looking at different applications, websites, protocols. Use SSH to log into a server. Use HTTPS to go to different websites. Use Radius authentication, TACAX authentication, things like that, and get really good at looking at what is, quote, normal, end quote. TCP dump is another way you can do that with a Linux system, and if you're using Kali in my 4710 class, sometimes you want to use TCP dump with the tail feature and then dump everything into a PCAP file, and then you can bring that back into Wireshark. So they give some decent examples of TCP dump on pages 125, but they don't go over the tail, T-A-I-L, parameter. So look that up, and I would get really used to using tail along with TCP dump. Network scanners that are very useful. SolarWinds has a decent one, but you have to pay for it. LAN Helper is more open source that you can use. There's a multitude of them out there. Just do a quick Google search, and you can find all kinds of different free network scanners. Manage Engine also has a really good one that I believe is free. Wireless scanners and crackers, we go over AirCrack in 4710 in one of our labs, and there's some other newer tools that are out on the market today, especially those that work with WPA3. So password crackers that are common out there, and these are basically used for an assessment to look at how strong your passwords are, and it helps to validate your password policy. So PWDump and Offcrack are two examples of those. Again, they're used not necessarily for cracking passwords, but to see and evaluate the password complexity. Vulnerability scanners, which are used extensively in industry, both by offensive security professionals as well as those in a security operations center and just internal IT. OpenVOS is kind of a de facto standard for openware, freeware. When you get into the realm of commercial software, Nessus is commercial. MBSA is by Microsoft. It's the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer. That's what that stands for. You can download that free from Microsoft, and that will help you audit Microsoft systems. OWASP Zap is free. You can download that and use it for web applications. Others that will work as an attack proxy, such as Burp Suite, are also good to know. And then there are commercial ones, Nexpose by Rapid7, Retina, and others are really good as well. Get used to using vulnerability scanners. Don't just rely on one. Rely on several. And there are also others that are out there that are completely online that you can use as well. Some command line tools. These are really good to start to get to know for scanning and enumeration of networks as well as the audit purpose of this course. So ping, netstat, tracert. Ping basically will tell you if something is alive or not. Netstat will tell you if a service is up or not. Tracert will give you the path to a target. NS lookup and dig is good for bringing up domain information, and we talked about that a little bit in footprinting in 4710. ARP, which will help you find MAC addresses to their IP on the local network. It's good to note that ARP will only work on the local network. Once you cross a router, ARP will not work. IP config, ifconfig, IP ADDR in Linux, newer Linux. These are good for finding your IP address, isolating your network. Very helpful if you're on a DHCP network. Netcat is really good for using. Actually, I skipped over Nmap. I apologize. Nmap is really good for just a port scanner. It is used a lot of times to help identify potential problems, especially if you're using Nmap scripts. And then Netcat is a utility that also can come with, say, the Kali system. It's a free download. It also works on Windows. I should mention that too. But typically, it's default in the Kali Linux operating distribution, and it allows you to read and write to network connections, either using TCP or UDP. Very helpful with SMB and setting up stuff in SMB and testing server message block for file shares. Some additional tools, general networking tools, such as just network login tools or login applications like PuTTY, TerraTerm, emulators. That's the word I was looking for. Stenography tools that are going to be explained later on in Chapter 8, but in cryptography. But for now, what you need to understand is that they are used as a process whereby you can hide data within something like a picture. Honeypots, we talked about a little bit. They're good for just setting up a logging instance and trying to filter abusive traffic to it. So let's go into troubleshooting some of these issues that you may come across. So troubleshooting access issues is pretty cut and dry. You either have access or you don't. But access can also be deemed as too easy. So is your password strength strong enough? Is your password where you store your passwords strong enough? Is it encrypted? Do you have the concept of least privilege operating within your organization? Do you have a strong security protocol such as TACACS, Kerberos, Radius, etc.? And is it set up properly? And then ensuring that you have strong authentication is also critical, and you can test that authentication in several ways. Configuration issues is one of the biggest problems within organizations, because a lot of times it's not a fact that you have organizations that don't patch or organizations that forego any type of vulnerability management. It's that an engineer or a sysadmin misconfigures or leaves something open after they've worked on it and a backdoor is set up. Digital certificate issues, I came across this all the time in the financial industry. The financial industry really relies heavily on digital certificates for processing of secure information. And unless you have really good understanding background of certificate authorities, revocation authorities, and administration of those, it can be really hard because you don't deal with certificates on a regular basis. Large firms that have a strong web presence, they have entire teams that's all they do is digital certificates. Personnel issues. These are typically handled by your HR department, and they're going to set up policies across the board, not just for IT and operations, but everybody. Sales, marketing, finance, IT, operations. Everybody should go through background checks. Everybody should go through drug screening. Everybody should go through all these different processes to ensure that we are hiring upstanding individuals to the organization. And there are some other issues that would fall into this as well. Most other obvious issues, unauthorized software, pirated software, non-licensed software. There's a lot of stuff on software, right? But those are just a few examples. So let's dive into some of the security technologies that we see on a regular basis. So we've talked about intrusion detection systems quite a bit, but we keep coming back to it. And on this point, we're going to really focus in on host-based software and systems. And host-based software and systems is important because a lot of times that is considered your last line of defense in terms of intrusion prevention. So having a good anti-malware or endpoint security solution is critical. Host-based firewalls for these devices and other types of assessment such as off-platform scanning, on-platform scanning, how often are scans done. So other types of systems can also include file integrity checking, application testing, GPOs within Microsoft. That's a really good example. Data loss prevention, unified threat management, as well as data execution and prevention platforms. Those are all critical systems that are really nice to have, and they enhance your security posture. So with identification versus authentication, we're going to get into, well, what both of them are. Identification requires a human to intercede and verify that someone is who they are. Okay, so that's having a security guard at a front desk or a receptionist checking a badge. It's not automated. Authentication is automated. This is where the user may not be who they are supposed to be, but they can impersonate, but we have some sort of control in place to ensure to a good likelihood that they are who they say they are. We can use combinations such as username and passwords, tokens, biometrics. Those are just a few examples. So with authentication, we have different types of factors: single factor, and then authorization. So authentication with a single factor authentication, or SFA, is where you just ask for a password, nothing else. Dual factor, which I don't have here, dual factor is where you ask for a username and password. They have it under here, but I guess they don't define that out in the book. That would be considered dual factor. And then multi-factor authentication, where you have an additional factor of authentication above two-factor, where you have a smart card, a token, a passcode, something else in addition to your username and password. So they also touch upon biometrics and federations. Biometrics, which have been around for a good 20 plus years now, and the technology has really started to solidify in the last 5 or so, especially with hand geometry, eye scanners, retina geometry, fingerprint scanners. They've gotten a lot more accurate. There are still times that they can be easily faked. For example, Apple with their iPhone several years back did facial recognition, and it was easily shown that you could get a picture of the individual, put it up to the camera, and bypass authentication rather easily. Apple went back and they corrected that, and they made their authentication much, much stronger, but still it was kind of embarrassing for them. A federation is a collection of computer networks or systems that agree on standards of operation, such as security standards from like ISO or NIST or things of that nature. And normally these networks are going to be related in some way. They're going to be associated in some way. It could be a Microsoft Federation. It's a great example of it, with a two-way trust or bidirectional trust. That's probably one of the best ways I can really describe a federation. So, potential authentication and access problems. So the main ones here is transitive access. And transitive basically means involving some sort of transition. So we get into kind of system states at this point in time. So keep in mind that as you go through and learn how transitive access works, say that one party trusts another party, and if a second party trusts the first party, the third party can automatically trust the first party if they trust the second party. These can get very enamoring very quickly, and these lattice types of concepts can be fooled at times. So transitive access has to be tightly controlled centrally, typically through a GPO or LDAP process. So using an Active Directory system is the best way, or an LDAP system is the best way to do that. Speaking of LDAP, so we kind of covered that. Also, older types of protocols that can be used for authentication. CHAP is used more so than PAP and SPAP. Kerberos is used extensively in domain federations, especially Active Directory. Radius is an open source protocol that is used for third-party authentication, or third system authentication, I should say, where you can connect in Kerberos or LDAP or Active Directory, or you can even have a local database for authentication. We see that a lot in AAA in infrastructure. Then there's TACACS, XTACACS, and TACACS Plus. TACACS Plus being a proprietary protocol developed by Cisco Systems. It's a client-server orientation. Know that it's very similar to Radius. It has the same purposes as Radius. The big difference: TACACS, TACACS Plus, XTACACS uses TCP as its communication protocol, whereas Radius uses UDP as its communication protocol. And then we have OAuth, or Open Standard for Authentication. It is a common method for authorizing websites or applications for access for information. It allows users to share this information with third-party applications, typically through APIs. We have one-time passwords or one-time paths, which are passwords that are used one time. Good example of that would be when you put your PIN on your magnetic stripe or on your chip for your ATM card. One-time pad. You put it in one time and then it's forgotten. Security assessment and markup language. This is a markup language similar to HTML, but more secure. It uses tags like HTML in order to develop applications and web pages. So let's get into how we install and configure different types of identity and access services. So from here, we need to know all the different definitions of the different access control methods. So this slide is very, very important. You will see questions on this, I guarantee you, on the midterm as well as your Security Plus exam. So the 5 primary methods are mandatory access controls, discretionary access control, rule-based, and attribute-based access controls. They all have different idioms about them. And again, going across this, read this on page 159 and 160, and get a good understanding of all of them. So mandatory access control is pretty stringent. It's all predefined. Discretionary has some flexibility. Role-based is going to be based on a user role, maybe tied to their account. You see that a lot in Active Directory with different groups. Rule-based access control, which is role and rule get confused a lot, but rule-based basically limits their pre-configured policies. And attribute-based access controls considers all of the various attributes, all of these, associated with a subject and object. Now, understand what a subject and object is. An object is something that you're trying to control. A subject is who's trying to control it in making the access control decision. So identity and access management technologies, we talked a little bit this before. This is what's used in multi-factor authentication makeup. So smart cards or pass cards. RSA is a really good one, but you can also even make your smartphone a smart card. Duo Security, and there are several other vendors out there as well that have this available to them, and they can leverage this software and just pass it on to your phone. Google also has a good application as well for multi-factor authentication. And then there's tokens, so specialized tokens that can be used within software to give you access. All right, coming to the end here, we're going to talk a little bit just briefly on file and database security. So this wasn't even included in the slide deck that I got from the vendor. I actually had to add this in. But file and database security is just as important from a permission standpoint. For those who only need to have access to a specific file or database, it needs to be defined, and it needs to be kept track with the permissions. Typically, your DBA or your system admin will control this and only amend it when authorized personnel give them the authority to do so. You can also put record locks on database records, for example. So if a record is trying to be accessed, Oracle's really good at this. You can lock that record down, and it takes a DBA to go back in there and unlock it. That would maybe constitute a incident response. Who tried to unlock the record? Who tried to get this data? Why were they trying to get it? What time did they get it? You can collect all kinds of information. And fundamentally, encrypting files and database systems at rest is a fundamental priority, especially on any system that may be mobile in nature, your phone, your laptop, your tablet. If you have files or databases that if that device got stolen, you need to have some pretty strong encryption so that the thief can't break into it at all. So wrapping this up, be able to identify the different types of tools we talked in the beginning of the chapter, Wireshark, TCP dump. Also know that misconfigurations are a vulnerability as well. It's a very common vulnerability. Not necessarily something that's defined, but typically those vulnerabilities are found by hackers, by pen testers, by just doing mundane tests, not necessarily using a tool. Review the many security technologies and protocols that we talked about in this chapter: Radius, TACACS, smart cards, tokens, etc. And understand how these concepts are used in authentication. So that's going to wrap up lecture. Let's just take a quick look here at the syllabus. So we're in week 5. I guess it might help if I pull this over to the screen. There we go. So we're in week 5, and we cover identity and access management. I had moved Lab 1 to be due here at the end of week 5. So I think I originally had it. Oh, wait, no. It is due at the end of week 5, cut and dry. Your second quiz is due at the end of next week, and that second quiz is going to cover chapters 1 through 5. We're getting closer and closer and closer to the midterm, okay, which is going to be in week 7. So we only have 2 weeks here before midterm week, and midterm week is going to be pretty intense, or actually I should say pretty intense because of the midterm, but pretty light as far as work. But you'll have some time to work on Lab 2 and Homework 3, etc. So with that, I'm going to close out lecture for this week. I will be going over, I think I've gone over Homework 2 and Lab 1 already. I'll be in office hours this week on Thursday to cover any of that, and I will see about introducing Lab 2 here in the next week or so that you can get started on that. So be on the lookout for that lecture hitting in the course documents in the weeks ahead. So this is Professor Brown. We're going to sign off and have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you next time.